Welcome to Bold Talk Series, where creativity, leadership, ideas, innovation come together. My name is Epi Ludvik, and today I have a privilege to have a short one-on-one conversation with Keith Koo, Vice President of the U.S. Capital and founder of host of the Silicon Valley Insider Radio show. Keith, great seeing you, man, and welcome to our Bold Talk Series. How are you?
I'm good, Epi. Thanks a lot for having me. It's great to see you both recently in person and, of course, online.
Yeah, man, it was awesome meeting you in the Bay Area, and truly looking forward to more of meetings again. And thank you for your time for this short format Bold Talk series. Now, Keith, you have a very interesting background. So, can you take us through your personal journey from an early career in information technology, banking, corporate development and finance to eventually becoming the VP of US Capital, but also you run a Silicon Valley Insider radio show and the founding of Silicon Valley Insider.
Yeah, thanks, Epi, and thanks for the opportunity to chat about that. I'd say that my career is a series of very fortunate accidents. I actually went to university and during a time in the United States where it was very tough to find a starting job, but actually through some of the internships I had, work experience, I actually got into a very prestigious program in banking from Wells Fargo, and that was a commercial banking program. And it's ironic because I actually didn't end up being a banker until now. I actually, because of the time in the 90s where things were consolidating, banks were merging, I actually got put on a team to do the largest bank merger in history at the time. And that was our bank, Wells Fargo, acquiring another bank called First Interstate. Very small by today's standards. But that led to a career in learning how systems worked, integrating systems, and ultimately what most people know me from my formative years, getting a job at Cisco Systems in the .com era in order to do M&A integration. How do we actually take companies that we acquire, incorporate their technology back into our systems in order to then sell that to customers? And that's really where things really started taking off. Did a number of acquisitions. I know it sounds a lot and almost an exaggeration, but in the 3 years I did that role, there were 52 acquisitions that Cisco did, and I worked on 38. So I did more than one a month. And then a .com crash happened, which many of us remember if you're old enough. And so I ended up doing technology, licensing, and deals. So all these companies I was integrating, all these vendors I was working with, I now had to manage those relationships. And that then led to understanding how technology deals, negotiations worked out. And I was still relatively young, but being able to work with companies that were our peers, I think it was a unique time in history for Cisco Systems when it was considered one of the premier, if not the premier tech company at the time. Certainly not as prominent today, but working with Microsoft, working with Oracle, working with all these relatively still today titans. As we do this conversation, Oracle popped 15% in their stock valuation. So not to get too long into that, but I had a chance to go to some other companies, got acquired, went back to Cisco, and then ultimately became managing director of a discipline called technology risk for MUFG Mitsubishi Financial Group North America. And that's really where my passion integrating technology with risk came into play. And then how you know me for the last 10 years is I've been doing advisory work, helping companies, whether they're startups or whether they're large corporates, on strategy, how to integrate technology. And that's what led to my career as an investment banker based on relationship. I fundraise now for companies. Back to the show, about 8 years ago, so I've been on my own for 10 years. 8 years ago, a local business radio station said, "Hey, you should do a show." And I said, "There's no way I should be doing a show." And through a series of 6 months conversations, I decided to launch Silicon Valley Insider.
Nice. And so for Silicon Valley Insider, tell us a little bit more in terms of what type of a conversation happens in the show and what's the aim for the show.
Yeah, the great question. So I think still to this day, radio versus podcast. Of course, my show becomes a podcast. Radio is a very large coverage geographically. And so when you think about technology concepts, what Silicon Valley Insider became or has become is a show in which we can distill very complex ideas into layman's terms. However, having said that, it's also become kind of a platform for innovation, investment, business, technology. And really, the key there is that the point of the show is not to sell. So even when the crypto craze was happening a number of years back, and it certainly still is in the mind of a lot of people, you'll never find me shilling or selling a cryptocurrency. A lot of people got that confused. I'd be talking about the technology of cryptocurrency, blockchain. How's that used? Why is that important? How do enterprises want to adopt that? And so Silicon Valley Insider became a platform that people and companies can highlight innovation, talk about things they're working on, book launches, and all in the context of really the point wasn't to sell, the point was to generate awareness and education. And I think that's really come to the forefront today with artificial intelligence. And again, I'll be the first to say that as you and I talk about AI, it's in the minds of everybody, it's in the minds of the investment community. In essence, as much as it's scaling very fast, I want people to be educated and aware of the technology, decide whether they want to use that or not, the safety of how to use AI, the ethics around AI or personal ethics around AI, and then how do then people not be fearful of that? Even in the United States, because I know we have an international audience, when you go outside of Silicon Valley, let's say other parts of the US, even some parts of New York, they were behind in wanting to use artificial intelligence just because of either fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
Yeah. Um, Great. Well, thank you for giving us an overview and your work and amazing things that you're doing. Now, let's go back to mergers and acquisitions.
Yeah.
So, in every founder's mind is about an exit.
Hmm.
Uh, we know, I would say more than half, or you know that better, more than half of mergers and acquisitions don't work properly. Many founders struggle with that in terms of when it comes to mergers and acquisition due to diligence and integration and so on. What common pitfalls do you see, and how can founders better prepare for these critical stages of growth?
Great question. And I think that the question on how can founders avoid pitfalls in being prepared for an exit, and although we're talking specifically about M&A, there's other forms of exits as well. In the terms of an M&A, there's a couple of ways that are happening. And there's a new one too that I'll get into. So we look in the context of a large technology company, Cisco back in the day, Oracle, Apple, companies that do M&A constantly. Things that they look for today, I'll go back and compare it in the old days, but today it's almost like an aqua hire. I mean, as we talk about Scale AI, the founder who's 24 years old, Alex Wang, Facebook, Meta, just
Yeah.
announced they're doing like a very many multi-billion-dollar acquisition, really to hire one person in their team. That is what we call an aqua hire. So that's where you've built some technology, you're really wanting to acquire the engineering talent. And so the technology might be somewhat important, but it's the skill set that's actually far more important. And even in recent times, Google is doing, I think last year, I forget the name of the company, but they basically hired the three founders and spun them in and then agreed to give something like a $500 million or $1 billion for the old assets, the old company to keep on operating to service their old customers. And so that's kind of like the new holy grail of an exit for very, very advanced program developers, technologists, architects. But the traditional way is you develop the company, you develop a product or service that's interesting to an acquirer. And so what you want to be able to do is make sure that if you could think about how to structure a company in the most simple way possible to be acquired. So, do you have a very solid tech stack? Do you know how to do the handoff? Do you have all the proper team members? Because acquisitions happen in a number of phases. Let me get into that. So, in one case, you could have pre-product, pre-revenue. That's like the easiest one to integrate. You're really just hiring the engineers, and if they have an MVP, minimum viable product, or something like that, then you can pretty much easily integrate them into the company. There's not really much to worry about. And then you have companies that are already having a few customers, they have a few employees or more employees. Really, when you get to that complexity of a company of, let's say, more than 300 to 500 people, and they have systems like ERPs and customer service and CRMs, and they have engineering, very large engineering environments for a technology company. Now you're talking about complexity. And here, let me tell you a personal story. So one of my own exits is when I left Cisco. I was there twice. I went to a company that was high flying, and I was there. They went from half a billion to $1 billion revenue in 2 years, and they had some challenges around financial disclosures that I actually had to help clean up. But HP acquired us. Now, if you know the story of Hewlett Packard, also a very large company like Cisco, Hewlett Packard actually operated more like a 70-year-old car company than it did a technology company. So under the hood, very old, antiquated, complex for this cutting edge technology company. They did not have the processes really. This was the largest. They had bought EDS and us at the same time. This is almost 21 years ago, 20 years ago. They did not have robust procedures to actually integrate a company that was mid-size, had all these systems, because to them, the cost of integration wasn't worth the effort. And so they basically shelved our systems. And then, year and a half later, so I went back to Cisco as a customer, having to go to these systems they took offline and to like figure out what things were going on. That's very complex. So your question was, how do we set yourself up for success in being acquired?
Yeah.
It's much easier today because most young companies are now in the cloud and they have things like Salesforce or HubSpot or standard systems. It's much easier, but I'm telling you that if you do things homegrown, one-off, it's going to be very complex and it might be too hard for the acquirer to want to deal with. And I've seen that too. I've seen lots of opportunities to acquire companies, but the products under the hood was just too hard to manage and be too hard to sell to the customer and service.
Yeah. Now, all this is really amazing because it's all about operational systems. What about the culture itself? Does the founders do the founders do a good due diligence in terms of the company that they're about to be acquired? Are they going to be a good fit? Are they going to be miserable in that company, or are they going to be happy campers? Right?
Yeah, that's also a really excellent question, and it gives me so many memories. Peter Drucker, famed strategist, said that culture eats strategy every day of the week, right?
Yeah.
So it's very true. I think that when you see the history of large companies like a Cisco, uh, reacquiring founding teams 2 times, 3 times, 4 times is not uncommon, because sometimes it's the same employees, sometimes it's the same DNA. I think that is a very straightforward. What happens there is that you actually upset other employees who feel like they were not the beneficiaries of being able to join an internal startup, get additional stock or additional compensation. Culture is very important. There was a time, do you remember Sun Microsystems?
Yeah.
Okay. So Sun was, equally influential as Cisco in the early days of the internet, and then they kind of went off, diverged, and they had the opportunity to buy Apple. They didn't do that. That was a famous story. Well, they got acquired. They put themselves up for sale pretty much, or had a hostile takeover. No, sorry, they had a hostile takeover attempt by IBM in like 2007 or 8. Okay. Culturally, Sun and Cisco would have been a great marriage. And the employees was a great marriage. Andy Bechtolsheim, founder of Sun Microsystems, then had gotten acquired by Cisco, went back and forth between Sun and Cisco a couple of times. And I'll say it, which I don't think I've ever said on air before, and I know the inside story. Ultimately, Sun got bought by Oracle. And that's because Larry Ellison and Scott McNealy were very good friends. And Larry Ellison and Steve Jobs at Apple were very good friends. Anyway, Scott did not want his company to die on the vine at IBM, and basically asked Larry and Safra Katz, um, co-presidents, to acquire the company, and they did. But culturally, the engineers would have fit much better with Cisco, hardware-related company. The reason why that did not happen, So John Chambers was questioned because remember, this is like where Samsung was starting to grow in technology. John Chambers was at a Samsung conference, a reporter the day that Oracle announced they were buying Sun for like $6 billion. The reporter cheeky was saying, John, did you really miss your opportunity to buy this great technology company? And John deadpan, which he rarely does, said, if Cisco wanted to buy Sun, we would have bought Sun.
Hmm.
Culturally, the engineers fit with Cisco really well. The senior executives, because there was a new CEO and I don't want to name him right now, culturally, that executive did not fit the Cisco culture. And ultimately, that executive didn't fit the Oracle culture either, because Safra had said that we don't have professional blogging as a role in our company. And so that particular executive did not find a home. So culture is always very important, whether you're big or you're small.
Yeah, very well said. And talk about those merger and acquisitions and what's the trend. Going back to Apple, I took a look at Apple. They've been doing that for years, like acquiring for the talent rather than hiring, rather than for the technology itself. And I think now probably that's what the trend is heading. Like companies are trying to replicate what Apple has been doing.
Yeah, and the reason why the trend is because it's much faster, much simpler. And like this case where Google is now just saying we're going to take your best and brightest, or who we think your best and brightest, and we leave the company
Yeah,
operating. We need to give enough money for that company to survive and to service their customers, but we consider that legacy. I mean, on one hand, that's kind of insulting. On the other hand, they didn't. It's like no harm, no foul, right? They're actually preserving it. And then from an operations perspective, because we were bringing that up, you don't have to deal with the regulators that much if there's a regulator involved. You don't have to deal with upset customers. And it's kind of like you didn't actually do a full integration. You just did a surgical precision. You extracted the elements you wanted and you left everything else in place.
yeah, very well. Thanks for bringing us on that journey. And so, for someone who are old enough to remember that those days and the Sun Microsystems, this was really good. Coming back to it now, Keith, you hosted the Silicon Valley Insider and you interviewed many founders, innovators. What patterns or characteristics you have noticed that separated highly resilient leaders from others?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point of view and question. I find, and having been on for 8 years, I've actually been able to see several founders' journeys and how even exits. And I'm actually pleased to reflect back that really on the not so happy side, 95% or more companies fail. So there's only the 5%. But there has been a actually pretty high hit rate of just the guests I've had on the show. I think that the common thing which you hit on, what's resilience, is this concept of grit. So GRIT, grit, or perseverance. It's the no matter what happens, I am going to keep first principles. And so what I mean by that is I have a startup or a few startups that I've mentored that we've had to pivot 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. And a lot of times, to a founder speaking to somebody who's very innovative, you have a great idea. And it might be a great idea, but then you might have to fine tune that. You might have to adjust that. One of my companies has had to do it more than what you would think. And right now has gone through a funding round and is doing quite well. And very different than what the original use case was. Maybe some underpinnings that look like the same, but it's become a quite different service and product.
Yeah.
So grit is the ability to persevere and pivot, not to be so locked into your own original thoughts and ideas. And then I think just leadership principles overall. What happens with companies, especially technology companies, is that if you are have been a founder multiple times with multiple successes, that's obviously a clear sign that you have what it takes and that you're going to do that. If you're a first time founder, Sometimes you have to be able to let go. And what I mean by that is sometimes early stage founders are not the right people to take it to the next level. And I think that founders have a lot of self awareness and are honest with that, can let go, right?
Yeah,
One of the founders I had on my show is FreshBooks. I forget the name right now, but the FreshBooks CEO was founder and CEO, and he took the company, for a decade. And then what he had to do was say that as he saw the advent of new processes and new technologies, he had to take 15% of the engineers, put them under NDA, and rewrite the entire code base. Now, that was a very brave thing to do because
amazing.
if people found out about that, there could be some animosity. So what happened was, and he said it on my show, it's probably 3 or 4 years ago, that he successfully did the transition. They created a new code base, but then exactly what happened is when they released it to the entire company, there was a lot of animosity, a lot of anger, a lot of resentment. And then I think ultimately, I don't know if that's the reason, but ultimately he, as the founder and CEO, only remained a couple more years. So he did what was right, or felt what was right for the long term of the company. Whether it was the right personal decision or I didn't talk to him after that. But that is something that was very, very, took a lot of forethought and bravery to put kind of your company on the line, because we see a lot of companies who stagnate and don't make that transition.
Yeah, yeah, it's amazing. Keith, when we met in Bay Area, we found out that we're both followers of Christ. How that faith in Christ has shaped you as a person who you are today.
Yeah. So to me, and I have two shows. I have Silicon Valley Insider, and that's on technology and business, and that's been on for 8 years. And then I have a 1.5-year-old show called 10 Talents off of Matthew 25, The Parable of Talents. And for people who get to know me, I don't hide my faith, but I also don't wear it on my sleeve. I don't lord my faith. And so I think the best way to explain this is the Apostle Paul and Jesus Christ had vocations. The Apostle Paul was a member of, so before he had his encounter with Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus, Paul was basically way more educated than I am. He basically went to the Harvard and Yale at the time. He was a member of the Sanhedrin. So he's like, think of Paul as being both a senator and Supreme Court justice for um, the Hebrews at that time. And when he came to Christ, he could no longer be the chief justice or Supreme Court justice of this faith, and he had to become a tent maker. And he funded his own ministry through this tent making. Of course, Jesus Christ was a carpenter. So for me, coming from, I grew up in a Christian home, but what I want to make sure is that my grandfather, one of my grandfathers, both are Christians. One was a professor, the other one, and came from multi generations of Christianity. My grandfather, and you're like, why, Keith, are you telling me all this? But this is how my faith is evolved. My grandfather came to Christ at a men's Bible study in Shanghai after an arranged marriage where my grandmother's family was very wealthy on the Eastern religion. Okay. So for those who come from an Asian background, basically my grandmother's family's whole business was on selling incense, offering things to the Chinese gods.
Mm.
And my grandfather works for Texaco, goes to a men's Bible study, converts. And that family is very strong in the faith. I've always seen, even growing up at church, what an early understanding between me and Christ. I came to Christ at 5 years old. I have a very early understanding of salvation. Um, that our faith is not simply whether you go to church on a Saturday or a Sunday or what have you. Our faith isn't just we check in and we check out of four walls of a church. That no matter what happens, we're always living a living testimony for our faith. And so what I've always wanted to do is be very authentic. And whether people like me or don't like me, I always want to be seen as who they would see me in any context of my life, whether it's my family, church, work, what have you. And then, of course, being an executive in the U.S., there are rules around how you do that. And so I would never want to push my faith on somebody, but I do want to talk about it. And so anytime anyone ever wanted to engage, I'd be happy to do that.
Amazing. Very well said. And yeah, I mean, this is what is all about. It's about, knowing yourself. And once you know yourself, you are very confident in going out there and impacting the world the way how you are brought, the way how you've been designed by this Almighty God, and whatever you want to call it. For the people out there who believe in other beliefs, but to us, like when we were having this discussion, it was so amazing because we clicked in so many things that, you know, as a Christ followers, that we thought was really amazing, like how we see the world from a lens, from this lens of the way how the early church was, is like the way of life, right? And so I just wanted to bring this up, and thank you for sharing that, and truly looking forward to have more of a great, amazing conversation with you and your better half, hopefully soon. And Keith, this is a short format conversation, bold talks. My last question to you is, what does the word bold mean to you?
Oh, well, bold means many things. I think bold, in a sense, means to have courage. To be courageous is what comes to my mind. And, often tying it back into our faith, being bold for our faith, being bold for our star. I mean, I think oftentimes, and you don't have to be overt about, I mean, you don't have to be demonstrative about that. Bold is this like burning fire within you to do something and to be different. And it's not necessarily be different in the way of like necessarily getting attention for yourself, but being intentional about how you're approaching things. One of the things I wanted to talk about, tying back into faith, my other show, 10 Talents, which is a year and a half old, those are stories on the intersection of your faith and your passion. So whether you want to call that work, you want to call it your volunteering, whether you want to call it on something that you're very passionate about, I think about how you do that. So, and why I wanted to bring this all together with this comment about bold, whether in faith or in work. I think people treat their lives, and you could separate out necessarily the faith. They treat it like pizza slices. So I do things at work, I do things at school, I do things for my family, and it's like being modular. But for people, international audience, but if we think about, that's like pizza slices. And I want us to be bold in living that there's Epi in the center of a hub and spokes, right? Hub and a wheel. So like no matter which spoke you're at, the hub is always Epi and Keith. And you're bold in who you are. Be authentic, be yourself. And so that's where I think the term bold comes in. And I really love that you've branded bold. That's always been, and also I want to clarify that although we met finally face to face for the first time, I mean, we've known each other for at least 5 or 6 years just through collaboration. And so
Yeah,
it's just great that we actually can meet in person.
yeah. Uh, so great to see you, man. Here, truly looking forward to seeing you soon. Always be great and always be bold. And thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you, Epi. I look forward to having more chats with you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Keith.